A rancher refused a fortune for his horse, then lost him, and when his son broke his leg taming a wild stallion, it seemed like disaster upon disaster. But these two apparent misfortunes saved his son's life from a deadly war. This is proof that absolutely everything has a purpose, and what appears to be a curse can, in the end, transform into a blessing that saves everything we hold dear. Many years ago, in a fertile valley surrounded by rolling hills and crystal-clear streams, there existed a small town in the heart of rural Montana. Near that village, on his modest ranch, lived Mr. Thomas Walker, a humble man of about 48 years, with a face weathered by the sun and hands hardened by decades of working the land. Mr. Walker wasn't rich by any measure that the world typically recognizes. He had just enough to ensure his family never went hungry, that his modest home stayed warm through the harsh winters, and that his few animals were cared for properly. But unlike many in the village who constantly complained about what they lacked, he always wore a serene smile, as if nothing worried him too deeply, as if he possessed a secret that made material wealth seem trivial. The townspeople often said he was poor, barely scraping by, but Thomas himself felt he was blessed beyond measure. His family was small but precious. His only son, Michael, a strong young man of 22 years, full of dreams and determination, and one very special animal that had become an irreplaceable part of their family. A chestnut stallion with a powerful body and intelligent eyes, whom they called Thunder. Thunder wasn't just any ordinary ranch horse used for simple labor and then forgotten in the stable. In his dark eyes, there was a different kind of brightness, as if he carried ancient wisdom in his gaze, an understanding that transcended the typical relationship between man and beast. His chestnut coat gleamed under the Montana sun like burnished copper, and his majestic bearing commanded attention from anyone who saw him pass. Even those who knew nothing about horses could recognize that this animal was extraordinary. He was strong as the earth itself, tireless on the longest journeys across rough terrain, capable of working from sunup to sundown without complaint. But at the same time, he was noble and gentle with those who treated him with respect, never using his considerable power to intimidate or resist, always responding with grace to kindness. What impressed people most wasn't just his physical strength or his remarkable endurance. It was his intelligence that set him apart from every other horse in the county. There was something about Thunder that made him different from any animal the valley had ever known. He seemed to understand Mr. Walker's and Michael's words before they even spoke them, responding to the slightest gesture of a hand, to a firm look, to a subtle shift in posture. The stallion obeyed, as if there existed between them a secret language that nobody else could decipher, a bond that went beyond training into something almost mystical. Michael had grown up alongside Thunder since childhood, learning to ride on his strong back when he was barely tall enough to climb into the saddle. Many times, on peaceful afternoons when work was done and the Montana sky turned the color of fire, Michael would lie against Thunder's warm side in the pasture, speaking in a low voice about his dreams, his hopes, his fears, as if the stallion could guard these secrets in sacred silence. For this reason, for both father and son, Thunder wasn't simply a work animal or a piece of property that could be measured in dollars and cents. He was a companion, a friend, a member of their small family who had shared in their joys and their sorrows, who had been present through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. For this family, Thunder had no price tag that could adequately represent his worth. It wasn't about money or labor capacity or convenience or any calculation that could be written in a ledger book. Thunder represented union between father and son. He embodied the effort they had invested together in building their life, and he stood as a living reminder of gratitude for what they had been given. He was a breathing testimony to the truth that real wealth is not always measured in coins and bank accounts, but in the companionship that sustains the soul when life becomes heavy, when the world presses down with its weight, when everything else seems to be falling apart. As time passed and Thunder's reputation for intelligence and strength grew, word of this remarkable horse spread throughout the entire region, traveling from ranch to ranch, from town to town, until stories about him took on almost legendary proportions. Until one day, there arrived in the village a wealthy businessman from the eastern part of the state who had heard about Thunder's fame and wanted to see this animal for himself. He came riding an expensive purebred horse and dressed in clothes so elegant they contrasted sharply with the simple, practical clothing worn by the ranchers and farmers of the small town. The murmuring of neighbors didn't take long to fill the air with speculation and gossip. Everyone knew that a visit from a man with so much money wasn't coincidence or casual tourism. He had come with a specific purpose in mind. The businessman had arrived with a single objective clearly fixed in his mind: to see with his own eyes the horse that people spoke about with such reverence, and to buy him, to add this remarkable animal to his collection of fine horses that he kept on his estate back east. He dismounted from his expensive horse and asked a local farmer where he could find the owner of this legendary animal. The man, recognizing the businessman's wealth and authority, pointed toward the small town square and responded respectfully, "Just a few minutes ago, I saw Mr. Walker there with his horse Thunder. You'll certainly still find them there if you hurry." Without wasting any time, eager to close what he assumed would be an easy business transaction, the wealthy businessman directed his steps toward the square, confident that his money could purchase anything he desired. And there they were, just as promised. Mr. Walker standing beside Thunder, the humble rancher buying some simple provisions before returning to his ranch for the evening. The contrast was striking and immediate. The simplicity of the man in his worn work clothes and dusty boots, standing beside the imposing presence of the magnificent stallion who seemed to guard him like a loyal protector, created a scene that stopped the businessman in his tracks. It was then that he saw Thunder up close for the first time, and he couldn't contain his astonishment, couldn't hide the desire that flashed in his eyes. He had never seen an animal so powerful, so perfectly formed, and so obviously well cared for despite the owner's apparent poverty. "This horse is worth its weight in gold," he said with genuine admiration, his businessman's mind already calculating potential value and profit. And when he finally stood face to face with Mr. Walker, his words didn't take long to emerge, direct and confident. Right there, in front of all the townspeople who had gathered to watch this unusual encounter, he offered Mr. Walker an enormous sum of money to buy Thunder. So much money that with that amount, Thomas could have stopped working for years, could have bought more land, could have built a fine new house, could have lived in comfort for the rest of his life. The village fell into expectant silence, everyone waiting for the answer that seemed obvious to them, everyone certain that no poor rancher could possibly refuse such an offer. But to the surprise of absolutely everyone present, to the shock of those who thought they understood how the world worked, Mr. Walker smiled with calm dignity and said in a clear, firm voice, "Sir, I truly appreciate your generosity, and I'm honored that you value my horse so highly. But Thunder is not for sale at any price. He's part of our life, part of our family. I couldn't trade him for money, no matter how much you offered." The whispers didn't take long to start spreading through the gathered crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Some townspeople said with disbelief and condescension, "This old fool is crazy, completely insane, rejecting so much money for a simple animal, for a beast that will eventually grow old and die anyway." Others added with cruel certainty, shaking their heads at such foolishness, "He's a complete idiot who will continue to be poor until the day he dies, and it'll be his own fault for not taking advantage of opportunities when they're handed to him on a silver platter." Their judgment was swift and merciless, their mockery born from an inability to understand that some things in life carry value that transcends monetary worth. But Mr. Walker, as calm and serene as always, as unmoved by their criticism as a mountain is unmoved by the wind, simply continued with his life, bought his provisions, mounted Thunder, and rode back to his ranch with his head held high. One early morning, when the rooster's crow had barely begun to break the silence of dawn and the first light was just touching the Montana hills, Michael went to the stable to get Thunder for the day's work in the fields, and he discovered that the stallion wasn't there. His heart immediately accelerated with alarm. He called Thunder's name repeatedly, his voice growing more desperate with each call, but the magnificent horse had disappeared without a trace. Michael ran to the pasture, checked all the fence lines for breaks, searched along the dirt roads that led away from their property, asked neighbors if they had seen anything unusual, but there was nothing. No sign, no clue, no indication of where Thunder might have gone. The absence of the animal filled the air with a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down on their small ranch. Michael spent the entire day searching, covering every inch of their property and beyond, going to the boundaries with neighboring ranches, following the creek beds, checking abandoned structures where a horse might shelter. He spent hours asking questions, checking distant pastures, even following hoofprints that eventually faded and disappeared in the mud and grass, leading nowhere. But as night fell and darkness covered the valley, exhausted and with his soul deeply troubled, he returned home without any answers, without any hope of finding Thunder. Michael, with eyes full of frustration and barely contained tears, asked his father with anguish clear in his voice, "Father, how can you remain so calm? We've lost what we valued most in this world. How can you just accept this?" Mr. Walker, with his voice as serene as a still lake, responded with the wisdom that comes from deep faith. "Son, don't rush to burden your heart with judgment. Don't be so quick to say whether something is good or bad. Time will show us what this loss truly means. There are things happening that we cannot yet see or understand." Michael stood in silence, unable to comprehend his father's peaceful acceptance, unable to grasp how someone could remain so untroubled by such a devastating loss. At the next dawn, still holding on to hope like a drowning man holds on to driftwood, father and son went to the village, trusting that perhaps someone had seen the distinctive chestnut stallion. They asked in the town square, at the general store, along the dusty streets, but the answer was always the same. Nobody had seen Thunder. Nobody knew anything about where he might have gone. And then the news began to spread like wildfire through the small community, traveling from house to house, from conversation to conversation. When word got around that Mr. Walker had lost his prized horse, the cruel comments didn't take long to emerge. "Old fool, this is what comes from not selling when you had the chance. Now he's lost everything and has nothing to show for his stubbornness. That horse was certainly stolen by someone smarter than him. What a disgrace! What divine punishment for his pride! He deserves this misfortune for being so arrogant as to refuse good money." Michael lowered his gaze, his eyes moist with the helplessness of not being able to defend against these attacks, the pain of losing Thunder burning in his chest like hot coals. But Mr. Walker, instead of becoming angry or responding with rage or defending himself against these accusations, remained silent for a few long seconds, letting their words fall harmlessly around him. Then, with his voice firm but still serene, maintaining his dignity in the face of mockery, he spoke in front of everyone gathered there. "If God has permitted this to happen, it's because there's a purpose that we don't yet understand. Don't rush your judgment of what this means. What seems like a disaster today may reveal itself as a blessing tomorrow. Who are we to claim we know more than the Creator? Who are we to say we understand His plans better than He does?" The simple man's words surprised many people, caught them off guard. Some fell silent, genuinely moved by his faith. Others made faces of disgust and looked at him with open mockery, convinced he was deluding himself. But on Mr. Walker's weathered face there wasn't a trace of doubt, not a shadow of fear or regret. While the laughter and cruel comments of the townspeople sought to drive thorns into his heart, to make him feel small and foolish, he remained serene, standing tall like an ancient tree that doesn't break even when strong winds blow with fury against it. His faith was a quiet strength that spoke louder than all their noise. "You're a complete fool, Thomas," someone shouted from the crowd. "You lost the only thing of value in your miserable life, and you still talk about purposes and God's plans? What you have is nothing but bad luck and poverty, and it's your own fault. Look at him," another voice added with contempt. "It seems like poverty has driven him mad, completely insane. And his poor son looks so sad, so defeated. You should have sold that horse to the rich man who wanted to buy him days ago when you had the chance. Now you have neither the animal nor the money. You have absolutely nothing. The voices rose with condescension, each word carefully chosen to humiliate him, to make him feel the weight of his supposed mistake, to force him to admit he had been wrong. And yet, despite this tide of contempt and mockery, Mr. Walker refused to be dragged down by it, refused to let their lack of understanding shake his faith. His calm was a powerful silence that shouted louder than all their mockery combined, a profound reminder to anyone paying attention that true faith doesn't depend on what you possess or what you've lost, but on the strength and resilience of your soul, on your ability to trust even when circumstances seem to contradict that trust. Life doesn't always show us its truth in the moment we're living it, my friends, he continued, his voice growing stronger as he placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. One day, we think we've lost everything, and the next day, we understand that what we called loss was actually a gift in disguise, a blessing we didn't recognize because we were too busy mourning. Don't look at life only through what your eyes can see today, only through the immediate circumstances. Look with patience and faith, because time is the only thing that truly knows how to separate what is genuinely good from what is genuinely bad. Michael looked at his father with astonishment bordering on awe. His father spoke with such deep peace, with such unshakable certainty, that it was impossible not to feel it, impossible not to be affected by it. And in the midst of his own sadness and confusion, he began to understand that perhaps his father's calm wasn't indifference or denial of their loss, but genuine faith. A faith that didn't depend on favorable circumstances, but rested on the trust that nothing happens without reason, that everything occurs because the eternal and all-powerful God permits it, whether it seems good or bad, to our limited understanding. That same afternoon, Mr. Walker and his son began their journey back to the ranch. The sun was falling slowly behind the distant mountains, painting their path with golden tones that seemed almost too beautiful for such a sorrowful day. Michael, with his voice trembling with emotion, broke the heavy silence between them. Father, I truly admire the calm you maintain even in situations like this. How do you do it? How do you keep believing when everything seems to be falling apart? Mr. Walker looked at him with tender understanding and responded with the serenity of someone who has learned life's deepest lessons. Son, everything in this life has a purpose, even when we can't see it, even when it hurts terribly. Although things may appear bad to us right now, many times they end up working for our good in ways we never imagined. You'll see this truth proven. Have faith, accept what happens without bitterness, and above all, give thanks even in difficult times. That's the secret to peace. Several days of uncertainty and sadness passed slowly, each one feeling longer than the last. But then, on one remarkable morning at dawn, while the sun was painting the Montana mountains with shades of gold and amber, Michael witnessed an incredible scene that he would remember for the rest of his life. Thunder was returning at a full gallop, and behind him came several wild horses, a small herd that had followed the stallion home. The young man ran toward them with overwhelming emotion, his heart pounding with joy and disbelief. Father, look! Thunder has returned, and he didn't just come back. He brought us more horses. This is a miracle! Hours later, when the townspeople learned of this astonishing news, the entire village seemed to migrate to Mr. Walker's ranch to see the spectacle with their own eyes. The same people who had previously criticized him so harshly, who had called him a fool and mocked his faith, now said with amazement and a touch of envy, "What incredible luck this man has. He's truly blessed by fortune itself. His poverty is surely coming to an end now." But Mr. Walker, showing neither pride nor excessive emotion, displaying the same measured calm he had shown during the loss, simply said with wisdom, "Perhaps Thunder went looking for his herd and now has returned with them. Let's not call it good fortune when we don't yet understand the full picture of what's happening. Let's not make the same mistake of rushing to judgment." Michael was filled with an overflowing joy that seemed to radiate from every part of his being, all because of Thunder's return and the unexpected gift of these additional horses. He embraced the stallion around the neck, running his hands through Thunder's mane as if he were reuniting with a lost brother, as if a piece of his own soul had been returned to him. The other horses maintained their distance because they were wild and unaccustomed to human contact, their eyes wary and their bodies tense with natural caution. But they didn't leave the ranch property, staying close to Thunder as if recognizing him as their leader. The young man smiled with renewed hope, completely convinced that this was a sign from heaven, a clear demonstration of God's favor and blessing. However, when he glanced at his father, he noticed that Mr. Walker remained calm and measured, not allowing the emotion of the moment to completely overtake him, maintaining his characteristic serenity. For Michael, this was the return of happiness, the restoration of everything they had lost, and more. For Mr. Walker, perhaps it was something different, perhaps another test, another chapter in a story whose ending they couldn't yet see. On the following day, Michael woke up with his heart overflowing with hope and determination. As soon as the first light of dawn bathed the fields in soft gold, he ran to the pasture where Thunder was grazing, now accompanied by the new horses. From the fence, he observed them with eyes full of anticipation, convinced that these animals could bring a new and prosperous future to their modest ranch, that they represented an opportunity to improve their circumstances dramatically. But when he tried to approach the wild horses, they immediately backed away with deep suspicion and fear. They snorted loudly, pawed the ground with their hooves in warning, and looked with distrust at his every movement. They wouldn't accept his voice, wouldn't tolerate his presence, wouldn't allow him to come near. It was as if they had erected an invisible wall between themselves and the young man, a barrier built from instinct and fear. Michael felt a sharp stab of frustration at this rejection. But seeing Thunder calm and peaceful, grazing without showing any alarm, he understood an important truth, that trust cannot be earned in a single day, that some things require patience and consistent effort over time. If my father trusts that everything has a purpose, then I must also trust, he said to himself with firm determination. And in that instant, he made a decision that would change everything. He would dedicate his time and his strength to taming this distrust, to converting these skittish horses from wild creatures into working companions and ultimately into part of their family. This is how his determination was born to begin domesticating them, even if it cost him hours, days, and even months of patient effort. Michael began the long process of training and gentling the new horses. He spent entire hours in the pasture, approaching with careful patience, speaking to them with a soft voice that gradually became familiar, observing every reaction to learn how to earn their trust, one small step at a time. The days transformed into weeks, and the weeks into months of arduous effort under both the burning sun of summer and the cold rain of autumn. Many times he finished the day exhausted, with his hands injured from rope burns, his body aching from falls and near misses, but his spirit never broke. His determination never wavered. Little by little, those animals that had initially looked at him with fear and suspicion began to accept his presence, began to recognize in him not a stranger or a threat, but a companion worthy of respect and trust. It was slow, demanding work, but Michael could see the progress, could feel the growing bond between himself and these magnificent creatures. But one fateful day, while Michael was attempting to tame the most spirited and aggressive of the wild horses, a powerful black stallion with fire in his eyes, the animal suddenly bucked with tremendous violence. Michael was thrown through the air and crashed hard onto the ground, landing with a sickening impact that echoed across the pasture. His leg twisted beneath him in a way that legs are not meant to bend, and he felt the bone snap with a sharp, horrifying crack. The pain was absolutely unbearable, so intense that for a moment everything went white and he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but feel the excruciating agony radiating from his shattered leg. And as if misfortune attracted venomous tongues like honey attracts flies, some townspeople who happened to be passing near Mr. Walker's ranch saw the terrible situation. They were the same people who had mocked him when he lost Thunder, the same voices that had criticized every decision he'd made. And now they returned to whisper with renewed cruelty, with malicious satisfaction. "See? I told you those horses would bring nothing but disaster and misfortune. Now his son is badly injured, crippled, This is what comes from not knowing when to quit, from being too stubborn and proud. Michael clenched his teeth against waves of pain, thick tears streaming down his face as he lay in the dirt. "Father, now you can't tell me this isn't bad," he said between sobs that he couldn't control. "Look what has happened to me. My leg is broken, I can't work, I can't help you. How can this possibly be part of some good purpose?" Mr. Walker came to his side in silence, moving with the calm urgency of someone who has faced many crises. He knelt in the dirt beside his son and carefully examined the injured leg with gentle but firm hands. His gaze didn't tremble, didn't show panic or despair. With a low voice that somehow seemed to warm the pain itself, that carried the strength of absolute certainty, he responded, "Son, don't say it's bad yet. Don't rush to that judgment. Time has mysterious ways of showing us its truth, ways we cannot predict or understand in the moment." In that same instant, as father and son faced this new crisis together, the criticisms began to be thrown like arrows aimed directly at Mr. Walker's heart, seeking to pierce his faith. "And now, Thomas, where is this divine purpose you talked so much about when you lost your horse? Look at yourself now. Your son is lying on the ground, his leg broken, unable to work or help you. What kind of blessing is this? What kind of loving God would allow this to happen to people who are already struggling?" The voices were sharp with accusation, with the self-righteous certainty of those who believe suffering proves the absence of divine care. Mr. Walker looked at them without becoming agitated, with the serenity of someone who doesn't need to defend himself against the noise and judgment of the world, someone whose faith runs deeper than their mockery can reach. His voice was firm but filled with peace when he responded, "The purpose is not always understood in the moment it's happening, my friends. Pain doesn't mean the absence of God. Sometimes it means the opposite. Means He's working in ways we don't yet comprehend. Don't call it disaster when the story hasn't finished showing itself yet. Time will reveal whether this is truly loss or whether it's teaching us something we desperately needed to learn." Mr. Walker didn't argue with anyone, didn't waste energy trying to convince them or defend his position. He simply tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt, found 2 straight branches to serve as a makeshift splint, and while Michael gasped with pain, he carefully immobilized the broken leg with practiced hands and whispered words of comfort. "Don't curse this pain, son. Sometimes pain is a demanding teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. If God permitted this to happen, He will also give us the strength to walk through it. That's His promise, and His promises never fail." Michael looked at him with eyes full of anguish and fear. "What if I can never work again, Father? What if my leg doesn't heal properly and I'm crippled for life? How will we manage the ranch? How will we survive?" His father's response was immediate and filled with gentle certainty. "Of course you'll work again, son. Sometimes God stops us in our tracks to teach us to walk in a different manner, to show us a path we never would have chosen on our own. Today, you don't understand why this happened, but don't rush your judgment. Give thanks for your life even when it hurts, even when you don't understand. The rest, leave in the hands of the Almighty. He sees what we cannot see." The wind swept across the pasture like an ancient hand offering comfort. The horses in the distance observed in silence, as if they too sensed the weight of the moment. And in the midst of crushing pain and overwhelming uncertainty, Mr. Walker's voice remained in the air like a promise that didn't need proof to be believed, like an anchor holding steady in a storm. The full truth of that day wasn't yet complete. The story had more chapters to reveal. Just 2 weeks after Michael's terrible accident, after his leg had been properly set by the doctor in town and he was beginning the slow process of healing, the entire country was suddenly plunged into war. The government began aggressively recruiting all young men across the nation to take them to the battlefield, to throw them into the meat grinder of combat. Nobody could escape this conscription. It was mandatory, universal, unavoidable. When the military recruiters arrived in their small Montana town, they went from ranch to ranch, from farm to farm, systematically taking young men from their families with cold efficiency. When the soldiers finally reached Mr. Walker's property and came to the door, They found Michael lying on a cot with his leg still badly broken, clearly unable to walk or march or hold a rifle. The recruiting officers examined him briefly and made their determination. They couldn't take him. He was medically unfit for service. They marked their papers and moved on to the next ranch, leaving Michael behind while they collected other young men who had no such injuries to protect them. Meanwhile, throughout the valley and the surrounding region, many other young men Michael's age were forcibly taken from their homes, torn from their families' arms despite desperate pleas and tears. Mothers screamed and fathers stood helpless as their sons were loaded onto trucks and driven away toward an uncertain fate. And tragically, devastatingly, most of those young men would never return from that war. The conflict was brutal and merciless, consuming the lives of an entire generation. The families left behind wept inconsolably as the terrible truth became clear. The air of the village filled with lamentations, with a river of grief that seemed to have no end, no bottom to its depths. Mothers embraced the empty clothes of their sons, pressing the fabric to their faces as if they could somehow bring their children back through the force of their love. Fathers stood staring at the horizon, with eyes that had gone dead inside, unable to accept the permanence of absence, unable to believe their boys were truly gone forever. The sound of sobbing mixed with the silence of homes that suddenly felt too large, too empty, houses that seemed to scream the absence of those who would never walk through their doors again. Those same people who had once mocked Mr. Walker so cruelly, who had laughed at his faith and called him a fool, now looked at him with completely different eyes. They saw him with something approaching reverence, with shame for their previous judgment, with the dawning realization of a truth they had been too blind to see. The same army that had ripped their beloved sons from their desperate arms couldn't take Michael because his broken leg had left him home. And it was then, in that moment of collective grief and devastating loss, that they finally understood what they had previously despised and ridiculed. The supposed misfortune of Mr. Walker and his son, the injury that had seemed like such a disaster, had actually been for their ultimate good, had been protection in disguise, had been God's mercy wearing the mask of tragedy. Among their lamentations and tears, they said with voices choked with emotion and regret, "We pointed our fingers at him in judgment. We laughed at his misfortune and mocked his faith. But look now at the truth we were too foolish to see. His son lives and breathes while ours have departed, and we don't know if they'll ever return. His words were true all along. Everything that happens is permitted by the Creator, even when in the moment it seems unjust or cruel or incomprehensible. We were wrong, and he was right." The silence that followed these realizations wasn't filled with mockery anymore, but with respect, with the humility of those who have been proven wrong by events beyond their control. Many of them finally understood that the faith of this humble rancher had seen farther than their hasty judgments could reach, that his trust in divine purpose had been vindicated in the most profound way possible, and that what had appeared to be devastating loss was actually divine protection, a hidden blessing that saved his son's life. Mr. Walker, with his eyes still calm and his voice still firm and gentle, looked at Michael and said with quiet triumph, "Do you see now, son? What seemed like disaster has turned into salvation in the most unexpected way. Losing Thunder was difficult and painful, but he returned and brought us more than we lost. Breaking your leg seemed like the end of everything, but it freed you from this terrible war. Life is like this. We never truly know what each event really means until time reveals its full purpose. We must trust even when we cannot see, even when it hurts beyond bearing." Michael, with tears streaming down his face, but now tears of gratitude mixed with grief for his friends who were gone, responded with a knot in his throat, "Father, now I finally understand the wisdom you've been trying to teach me. I cursed the day that wild horse threw me to the ground and broke my leg. I thought everything had ended for me, that my life was ruined, that there was no purpose in such suffering. But if it hadn't been for that pain, for that injury that seemed so senseless, I wouldn't be here with you today. My friends were taken away, and most of them will never come home. Their families will never be whole again. And I'm alive because of what I thought was a curse. Mr. Walker placed his weathered hand on his son's shoulder and continued with tenderness, but with a strength that penetrated deep into the soul that would remain with Michael for the rest of his life. Son, this is exactly why I told you not to call something bad when it hasn't finished showing itself, when the story isn't complete. The Creator writes with lines we don't understand at first, with a pen that sees the entire story from beginning to end. He sees farther than our eyes can reach and knows more than our hearts can bear to understand in the moment. Everything He permits with a purpose, even suffering, even loss, even pain that seems meaningless. Michael lowered his head, deeply moved by the weight of this truth, and said in a low voice, filled with remorse and new understanding, "Forgive me, Father. I doubted your words when you needed me to trust. I doubted your faith when circumstances seemed to contradict it. But now I see with perfect clarity that you were right all along. God never abandoned us for a single moment. He was simply guiding us along a path I didn't understand, protecting us in ways I couldn't recognize because I was too busy complaining about the pain." Mr. Walker embraced his son with strength, pulling him close, and with tears he had held back throughout all these trials finally sliding down his weathered cheeks, he whispered into Michael's ear, "Never forget this lesson, son. Never let it fade from your memory. Life is not measured by what we have or by what we lose, but by the trust we place in our Creator. What hurts today may save you tomorrow. What seems like a blessing today may test you tomorrow. That's why we must give thanks in all circumstances, in all seasons, because absolutely everything has a divine purpose, even when that purpose remains hidden from our understanding." In that profound moment, the silence of their ranch became almost sacred. The wind caressed the branches of the trees that surrounded their modest home, as if nature itself was confirming these eternal words, as if creation was bearing witness to this truth. And in Michael's heart, a new kind of faith was born, a faith that no longer depended on what he could see with his eyes or touch with his hands, but on what he had learned to trust in the depths of his soul. It was the kind of faith that could withstand any storm, any loss, any pain, because it was rooted not in circumstances, but in the unshakable character of God. The story of Mr. Thomas Walker and his son Michael spread throughout Montana and beyond, becoming a legend that parents told their children for generations. It became a reminder that we should never rush to judge whether something is good or bad, that we should trust in divine purpose even when we cannot see it, and that the God who sees the end from the beginning knows exactly what He's doing, even when His ways seem mysterious and His purposes seem hidden. What appears to be a curse may actually be a blessing in disguise, and what seems like the end may actually be the beginning of something greater than we could ever imagine.